Okay. So, first question, could you tell us a bit about your own background and journey and how you ended up becoming so deeply involved in asset-based community development?
Great. Well, good to be with you, Adam. And for those that are watching, good to have you with us in a conversation as well. So I'm really pleased for us to be having a conversation because I've known your work over the years and admired it deeply. In terms of my own story, I've often wondered, which parts are autobiographical, so that kind of almost determined my port of landing, as it were. But about 30 or more years ago, before I set up Nurture Development, which is actually 30 years old this year, uh, I was involved in working for the Irish Health Board, and specifically in the area of residential childcare. So I would have been quite heavily involved in that transition in Irish history from what would have been very large religious run institutions, where, as we now know, looking back, there were some very, very deep issues, and including child abuse and structural abuse and so on and so forth. So those institutions were largely being shut down in the early mid 90s. And the narrative was we were shifting into what we called community care. So kids were being taken out of very large institutions like Madonna House, where there were 80 to 100 kids, and it was a free for all. I mean, literally, kids were being taken out. Houses were being rented in different parts of Dublin. We tried our best to keep siblings together, and all kinds of things, I think, which were well intentioned but very badly done. And what kept falling off the edge of the table all of the time, in my view, was the community development piece. So while we were talking about community care, we really weren't doing anything that placed community as a vehicle of care. And I mean, even down to taking kids out of, quite complex but indigenous environments that they had been used to, and then often knowingly, perhaps sometimes unknowingly, placing them in very middle class environments, and just no reflection as such around our practice. So I became quite disheartened quite early on, and I raised my voice. I was quite a young practitioner at the time, and I was listened to, fortunately, by a senior social worker who said, "Well, look, how about we release you to do a little bit of searching to see if there are better ways of doing this?" And I had the benefit of having a few days a week to actually look at different models. And one of the approaches, I wouldn't call it a model, but one of the approaches that really caught my eye was the work at the time of Professor John McKnight in Chicago. And of course, as you know, John was one of the framing fathers, if you like, of asset-based community development. And I was just really, really struck by how he was animating communities. So I was very curious about the pedagogy. So I understood the theory. It's very easy to understand ABCD, but I was really always quite curious about pedagogy from the earliest days of training as a practitioner. And so I really, really needed to see what he was doing. So I went over to Chicago, got to know him. So this would have been around about 94,
Mhm.
and we connected. So I began to realize around 1995 that I had trained to do the wrong thing, and that what I really wanted to do was much more in line with community development. And it became pretty clear to me that the Irish Health Board really had no space for community development practitioners. It was, and again, I don't want to be critical at all of what they were, but they were largely folks that were trained in therapeutic or, medical model stuff. And while they talked a lot about community care, there was neither community nor necessarily Indigenous care in what they were doing. So I took a step out, and as I became more deeply involved with John and with the work of the ABCD Institute, that really, one year followed another. So in 96, it became clear to me I should try and operate outside of the institutional domain. And that's where I set up Nurture Development in 96. And my association with John then had continued right up until, he died obviously the year before last. So really a 30-year friendship, but also a mentorship, peer support ultimately. And so that's the essence of what brought me into the work. And as ever, no strategy or plan defined us. I can honestly say that it was one conversation after another. And but yeah, looking back, it's been an absolutely um, joyful and blessed in a lot of ways experience where I've been brought all over the world to be a conversation partner with lots and lots of interesting people. Maybe we can uh, give them a shout out as the conversation goes on.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we get to sort of talk a bit more about what ABCD looks like in practice, then
Yeah.
it'd be great to do that. So you sort of said in your last answer that ABCD is very easy to understand in theory. So I'm going to put that to the test. So can you explain ABCD and how it differs from conventional practice in the public sector?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really liked from the outset about it was that it was describing what regular people do
Mm.
when they're powerful. So, in a sense, again, I'm quite happy to be contradicted on this, but my own view of it, for what it's worth, is that I would see it as a description more so than a model, by virtue of the fact that it emerges out of, if you go back to the origin story of ABCD, and I've got to be a little bit careful here because, of course, all ABCD is describing is what human beings have been doing for thousands of years, so it's questionable whether there's an origin story, but in the self-conscious sense of, what was it that McKnight and Kretzmann, Professor John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann were doing with their colleagues. I think what they were really doing in the late 80s was kind of an appreciative inquiry in the sense that they were going into neighborhoods. Over 4 years, actually, they went into 300 neighborhoods, and they were intentionally listening for, stories about how neighbors got together to make things better where they lived. And in that deep listening and the curation of the insights that emerged from those stories, they were able to sit down and divine, if you like, my goodness, there's actually something here which is important to pay attention to and largely is being sidelined by the dominant conversation. So what did they identify was worth paying attention to and what was being sidelined? Well, the piece that they identified as important was that people were saying, hey, we do things which are consequential and we do them with each other and with local resources. Doesn't mean we can solve all problems. It doesn't mean there aren't structural issues, but it does mean that what we're doing is consequential. And it is consequential at a range of levels, including well-being. So in a sense, and safety and raising our children and care and so forth. So in a sense, they felt that that story had merit in and of itself. Just hearing that story, validating that was important, but also they recognized that there was a tension in the reality of that story, in that it was kind of gasping for breath, because there was another more domineering story that was alive and pertinent to the context of people like professors who would come in and typically not ask communities to share stories about how they were powerful. They'd ask them to share stories about, what were the issues, uh,
Mhm.
what were the gaps, what were the needs. All valid questions, but they found that, in a sense, asking those questions tended to eclipse the conversation that they were having about the capabilities, if you will, now the assets that people had in communities. So I don't want to necessarily say in that sense that it's easy to see it because there can be things that obscure that reality. But once you kind of clear it away and you say, actually, I just want to get alongside people and hear
Mhm.
them tell their story about their agency Most people can answer questions like, could you share a story about a time, even if it wasn't you, but you saw regular people get together in a local place and make change happen. It could be anything from organizing, a community walk to a march, but, size doesn't matter. Do you have a story? And I do this at the beginning of all my training, and I sometimes joke with people, if you can't think of a story yourself, borrow one from one of your grandparents. And at worst tilt, if you can't, make one up. Because actually what I want you to do is to try to just expand your imagination to entertain the idea that people we regularly see as on their knees and as needy also have capabilities. They are producers and not just consumers. And invariably, people will have a story. So even in our lived experience, we have stories. And I often do this with professionals. I'll say, take off your professional hat and tell me a story about a time you saw neighbors get together to make things better. And then I'll say to them, now, just take a moment, kind of zero out a little bit, get in your helicopter and take a bit of distance. What resources were people using in those stories? And that's what we mean by assets. So what were the things? So what John and Jody did, and subsequently I was involved in, and others, lots and lots of others, is to say, well, when you listen closely, really, to the stories that people share across thousands of communities, across not just the North American context, because that's where they started. So they were in Canada and the US. But now we've had the privilege of, hanging out across a lot of different places. What you begin to realize is that there's patterns, if you like, in what people say they use in order to be powerful. So one of the key things is people will say that it was driven by local residents. It was driven by people who live in their community. And it was people who defined themselves by what they could contribute to their neighbours, right, in one shape, form or other. So that something they knew, something they felt strongly about, something they could make or do, or something that, they could stand on 2 feet to do, like march or resist. So in that way, there was something really important and central about this idea that it wasn't programs that were changing things, it was people that were changing things. And in this instance, they were listening to local stories, so they were hearing stories about local people. The other, I guess, asset would be what they called it. I'd sometimes hesitate with the word asset because it can mean lots of different things to different people. Often the conversation defaults to buildings and money, and I don't want it to, because I think the other resource that people find very enabling and ennobling is associational life. So, the first one there I talked about was people. You could say citizenship. People who are kind of defining themselves by what they can contribute, make, do, produce. Well, the second one is the associational base. So if community is the definition of people being in relationship with each other, association is people in powerful relationship with each other. So I'm thinking about kind of Alexis de Tocqueville and democracy in America and this idea of association as distinct from network. So an association is a collective noun for citizenship. So this is where I kind of part companies sometimes with some thinkers that say it's all about citizenship. I say, yes, it is a lot about citizenship. But let's remember that the aggregation, the cooperativism, the collectivism is about associational life. And sometimes that means you got to associate with people that you might not always agree with, that you might not always like, because we organize not with the neighbors we wish we had, but the ones we do. So the other human, like those first two assets or resources are human assets, right? The individual and the association. So you can have an individual with a lovely singing voice, but they can't be a choir on their own. So there are things in human existence, in political change, and in health that we need associational life to achieve. You see this, I saw this very graphically in Kibera when I worked, which is, I hate to use the term, but they use the term slum in Nairobi, and the power of the burial society to influence behavior change among young men around sexual health. Incredible. And when you compare that to the power of a public health practitioner, and again, I want to honor their work, I'm not minimizing what they do at all, but by goodness, if a young man was doing something to harm somebody else in terms of their behavior in that community, and the burial society understood the nature of, their behavior is harmful, they would hold folks to account. And there's something psychologically, you may agree with it or not, but there's something psychologically incredibly powerful about, in that context, knowing that you are a member of a burial society, which is essentially a cooperative that you pay into, so you know you'll be buried with dignity, or a family member indeed, saying to you, you got to change the way you're behaving in relation to women. We don't operate like that around here. That is far more impactful than, as I say, an outside actor coming in trying to change behavior, albeit, through education. But notwithstanding, the third human asset are local institutions, right? So these are institutions that I would say, like, institutions come in two shapes. Basically, there are those that are inward focused and are kind of, interested in survival. And in fact, if they have to throw their mission under the bus in order to save their institution, they will. We all know that. And then there's institutions that say we exist in order to uplift communities. Our assets exist in order to be of service to communities and to be a supplementary service to communities, not just to be a monopolistic kind of entity. Well, those local assets do exist, whether they come through practitioners or they come through land or whatever. So there's lots of institutions. I think in Ireland now, because I'm calling in from Ireland, and I just had a call with my friends in the credit union. The credit unions are a really good example of this. Compare a credit union to a bank, and you really understand what I mean. So there are some institutions that are just more convivial. You're much more likely, for example, to see conviviality and see community happen in a library than you are down in, the courthouse, for example. So not all institutions are created equally. So we work a lot with, and we hear a lot of great testimony back from community folks who'll say, we know this community has our back. And often people might not even be a member of the institution. I talk about credit unions, but credit unions, particularly when they function well, are really kind of undergirding not just of the people who are a member of the bond, the credit union bond, but the wider community, because of course they're influencing the local economic system in a lot of ways. Your listeners will know, that people who are part of the course will know, that credit unions have a checkered history. So unfortunately, a lot of them now are centrally regulated. Mm-hmm. So what ends up happening is you take something that's really a fantastic local institution and then you over-regulate it, or under-regulate it. Sometimes it can be the reverse of that. And what you end up with is something that's almost like this poor second cousin or third cousin of the bank, rather than, understanding what it is, which is actually a cooperative means of finance, where people who are economically poor and couldn't get mainstream cheap credit from the banks, or you couldn't even get credit at all, actually had to galvanize what little bit of money they had, collectivize it, and undergird their visions and their dreams to move forward. And that really is the history of Ireland, actually. Yeah. And credit unions are quite young in the historical sense of movements of change. But, we're going back to, I think the first one in Ireland was in Dublin 8. And that was, I think, around 58. So, those institutions are key. So you hear people kind of talk a lot about the residents, the associations, and then the institutions that are community facing. You also hear them talk a lot about place. So the built and the natural environment as being not just a context, it's obviously the stage on which everything plays out. The hyperlocal neighbourhood is the unit of change, if you like. It's a really interesting concept. But also the way in which they are embodied and experience place really matters to health. And we see this, like there's a lot of really interesting research coming out around brain health now and the role of place. So it takes us beyond the skin of the individual outside into a kind of much more ecological
Hmm.
experience. And that's really, really important. I know a lot, again, of people on the course will understand that the context of the environment, particularly the hyperlocal environment, is really significant. Often we understand it in very practical terms, so everybody can, from a public health perspective, everybody has a story like Flint, Michigan, where a public health practitioner and local government person made a really disastrous decision to save money, which essentially triggered a calamity in public health terms around lead in the water and Legionnaire's disease and so on and so forth. But what's really interesting is that while there were structural issues that caused that, it really played out at a very, very local level. Of course, that's the story of public health, isn't it? We understand you literally got to walk the territory and find out where these things are actually being communicable. So in that sense, I think place really matters. For good and sometimes for ill, depending on what's happening. We also, we hear a lot of people talk about the importance of the local economy. And I think what I hear them saying is not just money, and money is important, of course, cycling money around the economy, but also exchanges. So that exchange, whether it's fiscal or non-fiscal, is really important in the local context. That could be an exchange of credit, it could be an exchange of voluntary contribution, it could be an exchange of care, and also of money. So those five are kind of key, and the sixth one that I would mention is stories, which are the carriers of meaning, the carriers of culture and heritage. So just to go through them again, you have the individual, the associational, the local institution, the place, the economy, and the, if you will, the heritage, the stories of place. So for us, there may be others, but for us, these are the six that no matter where we've been, seem to be present universally. Happy to be contradicted in that, but I've never come across a place that some element of these were either latently present or more actively present. They're there, but largely they're invisible and they're often devalued. So our work is to make them visible and to make them valuable in very practical ways. And that's what I mean by place conscious pedagogy. How do you actually do the work to support folks that are involved to discover, connect, and mobilize those assets from the outset? And this, like, it's, as I said, simple, but the consequences of this are quite significant. So if my mindset is I'm coming in from outside and I'm bringing health to a place, this immediately says, no, you're joining health creation in that place. And that's a beautiful thought, that we start where virtue is already afoot and then we supplement that. Immediately, you can fail at being a hero and fail at being a god. And I think that's an incredibly exciting thing to consider.
Thank you. What an incredibly eloquent explanation of ABCD. I really want to explore the role of the public and the health sector in that, in those assets. But first, before we do that, I just want to just dig down a little deeper into the relationship between those six assets and the health, the literal health of a community. What is that relationship, and why is it so fundamental, do you think?
Well, that's a great question, Adam, and it's a hard question in some ways to answer because I think often health is defined as the absence of disease or sickness, and we all know, of course, from the Ottawa Convention and even just by lived experience, we know it's certainly a lot more than that. So health and well-being, I guess, properly understood, if you will, uh, and this, of course, relates not just to our thinking in ABCD, but the determinants of health. So there's a very clear scientific base to this, and evidence-based to this in terms of population health. We can understand that the drivers of health and well-being are contingent on, of course, my own personal behavior, and I don't mean in any way to say that out loud and suggest that I'm victim blaming, but I am an agent. If I walk more, I decide not to walk, that has consequences around how well I am and my health, and how quickly I recover if I get sick. But so too, it's true to say that my associational life is really, really significant. So the number of people I know by name, the extent to which we are doing things together, the extent to which I missed on the days I don't show up to my book reading club or whatever I mean, are really, really consequential. And we know this. We kind of tend to talk about this in the kind of negative terms. We talk about loneliness, which is the absence of associational life, or well, social isolation is actually. But I think also loneliness, because associational life isn't just having lots of people. It's also having a depth of psychological community. So in that sense, I think associational life is the great antidote to loneliness and social isolation. But it's really interesting too, because it defines me as an agent of change. It says, I am a citizen and I can make contributions. I matter in the sense that I do things that matter not just to me, but matter to other people, to my environment, even very small things. And that psychologically is really important. There's some really interesting research done by What Works Wellbeing, which sadly shut down, I think, prematurely, really, in my opinion, but they were doing great, great work. And one of the things that they did was really try to understand, what's the undergirding of health? And they identified that social cohesion, neighborhood belonging, and a sense of community power, which I know is very close to your heart, Adam, from your work in New Local, that these were the three things that were absolutely, important. Now, I think associational life is where I get a sense of power, that I am not on my own. It shifts the me into the we. And even in the face of very solid difficulties, I may still continue to struggle to pay my bills. I may still continue to suffer from an environment that's not good for ostensive purposes, my health. Notwithstanding, there's something really consequential in this idea that I can be an agent. I can be an autonomous, self-directing person that can cooperativize, can actually come together with other people. And sometimes in the medical world, we underestimate that. That idea of the political and the social nature of health, and we over medicalize it. So this is really important. In fact, most of what we mean by health is social and political, right? So that idea of agency as a political act in the small p sense is really important. Now, also being in a place where I have institutions that have my back, that extend in a liberal democracy, extend that agency, is really important. So I can be in an environment, there's some parts of the world, as we know, there's some countries I thought it would never happen, but it has, and it is, where the idea of your institutions being an extension of your civic and associational capacity is receding. But in a liberal democracy, there's this idea that as well as having rights to services, we're also able to align our agency with the agency of services. And that's a very different thing than having a conversation with a corporate entity that's for profit. So, for me, I think this idea that myself, that we ourselves, that our environment, that our economy, in right relationship with each other, to use an indigenous way of knowing, are what actually really drive and determine our health, in large part, not exclusively. And that, somewhere between 15, maybe 20, some would say 10% of the rest of the stuff is related to medicine proper, or, the interventions of some expertise. And it's not to minimize it, but to, just get the proportionality of it right. We really begin to see that the social and political determinants of health are really, it's where it's at. Now, the question might be, if that's true, how do we mobilize people who've internalized the story that my health is in the hands of the doctor, that my safety is in the response time of the police, that my child's education is in how good, the classroom teacher is, to actually see themselves as primary actors in that conversation. I often I have a saying just to try to get this across in a kind of a pithy way where I say, if sickness is your focus, then the doctor is the key actor. But if well-being is your focus, then the community is the key actor. Does that mean the doctor doesn't matter? No, of course not. That we're really encasing our conversation within the context of the neighborhood as the unit of change. And so I think, that's what I would think of as health. But by the way, that's all. If you were asking me this and you were a police constable or a senior leader in police and you said to me, talk to me about safety, I think I'd give you a similar answer. Or if you were, interested, talk to me about child well-being or aging, I think I'd give you very similar answers because, as I think it was Margaret Wheatley said, whatever your question is, community is the answer. And that's over-egging it slightly, but I think it's an interesting one.
So that raises, the question really of what is the role of the health worker or the public sector worker more generally in asset-based community development, because I think what you've expressed incredibly clearly is that what ABCD is really about is about identifying, understanding those assets, and the community seizing agency and power for itself. There is power just within the community. So what is the role of the health sector and public sector in that? Can they have a constructive role, or is it more a question of sort of stepping back and letting things flourish?
That's a great question. So I think this is really the nub of it. So nature has always fascinated me, and for two reasons. One is just that things grow. That's beautiful. Yeah. The other is that things grow to a point. So they don't grow to a point of being grotesque, like my dog, different sized dogs, but I've never seen a dog that looks like an elephant. So things tend to grow proportionately. When we get to the human conversation, sometimes things or institutions, they can kind of grow out of proportion. So this is a conversation about proportionality. So what I want to say is, though we're talking about self-determination, autonomy, and sovereignty, it would be, I think, a profound misunderstanding of what I'm saying to suggest that communities can do it all on their own, or that there are no limits to local, because there are. Of course, there are limits to local. So a way of thinking about this that certainly seems to land well for me in my mind and seems to work for a lot of people is, I have a metaphor that I use of a 3-lane swimming pool. And in each swim lane, there is an attempt, a good faith attempt, to maintain boundaries, but also to be useful to the other lanes as appropriate. So in the first lane, I always intentionally put community. So because we're talking about health, what are the things that communities can do that are health creating? So I know if I live in a one-up, one-down apartment, I could be involved with other neighbours in putting a greenhouse on top, which would grow tomatoes and vegetables, which is, going to create nice, nutritious, in-season local food for us, which is good for our health. It's also going to create a passive oversight in terms of safety, so we can see what's going on in the neighbourhood. It's going to create a connection between young people and older people. Probably will make me think a little bit about returning the bees back to the environment. It might also be something that I bring to the farmers market. So in all kinds of ways, it creates an interdependence within my environment. So there's lots of things that communities can do that are health creating. But do I want one of those people, if I get a heart attack in the greenhouse, to pull out a knife and start operating on me? Absolutely not. Right? So love them as neighbors, love them as, tomato growers, but I don't want them to be my surgeon. And even, and this is important, even if they are a surgeon, if they're acting in that neighborhood capacity, aside from maybe doing a little bit of, resuscitation or whatever, I really I like the idea of being able to get to the hospital. So we'll get to that in a second. But before we get to the third lane, where, the hospital and all that important stuff. There is the second lane, the middle lane, and that's where co-production, co-creation, light touch is happening. Now, to an extent, there's going to be a little bit of slip over between the second lane and the first lane, because sometimes in some communities you do need to do some precipitating, not provision, but you need to animate the work. 500 pounds to buy the equipment to actually build the greenhouse could really be the difference between it happening and not happening. But I'm happy to build it myself with my neighbours, kind of thing. So a little bit of a precipitant. But in that second lane, people as professionals are doing really important work, but they're on tap, not on top. So it's kind of facilitative, extension work. A woman she's at end of life, but between 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock, or 11 and 1 o'clock, she likes to meet some of her neighbours, play cards, have a chat, whatever, knit and that, or whatever it is. It may be really, really essential that people from the hospice or whoever looking after her manage her pain medication so that she can stay lucid during that period, where she's kind of agnostic as to whether she's kind of a little bit out of it, so to speak, because of the medication between sort of 3 and 4. And again, you have a practitioner who goes, yeah, I get that Betty wants to be with her neighbours during that time, and I'm going to provide something that's within my expertise that enables that. So again, this is not something that you'd give to a neighbour necessarily, although some practitioners I know would argue you should, but notwithstanding, for ease of description, there's a clear role there. Now, in the third lane, there are things that we do need our institutions to do. And actually, we have a right to expect them to do. So their expertise, the science, this is really important. I have woken up to this so much as I've kind of watched different authoritarians play back some of our language around community self-determination, sovereignty to us in a most grotesque way. So I think we have to be really careful here. I am not in any way suggesting that professionals and institutions don't matter. What I'm challenging is monopoly.
Yeah.
Right? So I really believe we can coexist in ways that are advantageous to community. And here's the thing. I think it would also be much more advantageous to professionals in terms of levels of burnout if we were to say, we're not going to do anything the community can do themselves, but we're going to remove the barriers and we'll take precipitating steps to enable the environment so they can flourish. There are things that we must do together, but we're going to do it with humility. And we're going to do it with a clear exit strategy so we don't build dependence, but we disintermediate so we can focus on other areas as needed. And there's things on an ongoing basis that we must provide. We must do for our community because that's how a good, organized, civil, democratic society operates. I've never encountered a community, except in very, very grim circumstances, that wants to take in charge their rubbish collection. So in that sense, I think we can really think about this conversation as a sequential and proportionate conversation rather than what a lot of people do. They kind of try to make it a conversation about balance or big and small. And I think that's really, really unhelpful. So this is why the big society narrative really fell down. And an awful lot of how it's framed in the US is problematic because it's actually not about right or left. Maybe it's about illiberal and liberal, but it's certainly not about right and left. And I think forcing people into those binary conversations is problematic. And I do think that's some of why the North American stuff around ABCD is a little bit, to my mind, problematic as well. It lacks some of the nuance that I, as a European, want to hear. So hopefully I've given some of that nuance.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And maybe what I could do is, if I could ask you, maybe you could give an example of where you've seen ABCD really take off, really flourish as an approach, and talk a little bit about, what role did Lane 3 play in enabling lane one, if indeed it did play an enabling role in that.
Yeah. So there's lots and lots of examples, but a couple kind of come to mind. So I'll share two briefly. And the reason I want to share them is because I think the challenge often in doing this work is you'll see either this beautiful expression of ABCD in the micro sense, right? And so you see, wow, a lot more, community animation, a lot more connection and so forth at the local neighborhood level. But what you don't often see is at the macro level where there's better commissioning, there's better procurement, there's a better understanding actually that institutions are supplementary rather than primary, if you like, in a democracy. So I'm going to try and see if I can use two stories to unpack and parse apart how you get both, right? So one story is from Leeds, from the adult social care in Leeds, where they really wanted to begin to think about how people who would, as they get older, otherwise end up in maybe an institutional environment they didn't want to be in, how they could animate alternative community responses in safe ways. And one of the things that this is going back to 2012 in Leeds and the likes of Mick Ward and people like that, they began to realize, that the system had organized itself in many respects in a very individualistic and pathologizing way. So a social worker would encounter an older person, would do an assessment of need, and often that would send them on a journey into service land in the sense of an institution. And look, it's kind of understandable how this happens. So it becomes any port in a storm. So what Mick and others wanted to do, and I was, slightly involved in it, but they largely led this themselves, was to say, well, what happens if we actually create another port? If there's a community alternative, so that rather this individual being completely isolated, they have connections. And the classic example they often share is the example of Robin, who was a gentleman who'd become quite isolated after his wife had died. So he was getting third sector supports, Meals on Wheels, that, a little bit of bereavement counselling or whatever, but he was becoming increasingly more and more isolated. And one of the things that I think that Leeds City Council did really well was they, first of all, employed a community animator to work in Robin's neighbourhood. So this is somebody who's paid to get out and discover, connect, and mobilize those six assets. And what's kind of significant about that as well is that this person isn't just doing it on their own, they're also trying to influence other practitioners. So if you go into any neighborhood, there's an ecosystem of all kinds of professionals who are often working in silos. And as we know, silos are where smart people go to do silly things. So you can really disrupt that with a little bit of modeling, and they provided ongoing training as well, which they do to this day. This story started 10 years ago or more. But what was interesting about that is just putting Robin in the center of the story is one of the people that was working with Robin, who was kind of trying to support him with his grief, asked Robin a very classic ABCD question, which is, what makes your eyes dance in your head? Like, is there anything you do that really just gets you going? And he said, yeah, I love making walking sticks. So Robin, incidentally, used to work for the council in the Parks Department before he retired. And, had spent a long lifetime collecting fallen branches and carving them into walking sticks. Long story short, Robin had a lot of walking sticks in his shed, which he'd never shared with anybody. And this practitioner with very light touch training essentially made the connection between Rob and his gift and a wider community. So what's really interesting here is kind of the alchemy that emerges out of that, created the conditions within which Robin kind of as an isolated individual and maybe getting Meals on Wheels, maybe going to the local community centre to sing Roll Out the Barrel or whatever, is now actually a leader of a carpentry group, and there's all age groups. It's not just older people. So I think what was kind of neat and clever about that is that I'm not sure that Robin would say, well, the reason all of that was in place was because Leeds City Council retrained their procurement officers so that they could begin to create more latitude. And then the commissioners actually started reimagining the unit of change as not being Robin and his isolation and providing a siloed service, but saw Robin as somebody with a gift in a neighborhood, and that the trick was to connect that gift to a community group that was willing to receive it and then see what happens. Surround them with services if necessary, but be prepared to kind of lean. So lean in as you need, but lean back when you don't. And this is one of the challenges, kind of the paradox of, the old public sector model is that you can never get a service when you really need them, and you can't get rid of them when you no longer do. Right? So the lean out and lean in piece is that kind of flexibility. Like it's almost like our public services need a hip so that they can do this. And so rather than falling on their face because they're leaning in so much, they can't pull back again. So it gave that kind of lever to enable folks to go, well, if there's a community alternative, let's animate that alternative and lean back. There we're proximate, obviously, if there's a crisis or a relapse or whatever it might be. And this is interesting because in the same neighborhood, right, you can go just to another story where somebody has gotten fantastic interventions around recovery in terms of their addiction. They go back into the community. And as I always say to people working in recovery, where does relapse happen, folks? It doesn't happen in your program. It doesn't happen in the hospital. It typically happens in the community. Mm-hmm. So if your program isn't considering relapse, then you're not at the races. And relapse can only be addressed by the precipitation of community response. You can't provide services for relapse. You've got to precipitate the conditions. So in this sense, what we're talking about here is we want to get something working at the macro level for the individual in recovery, for Robin, and so on and so forth. But what we also want is we want to make sure that if we have an animator in the neighborhood, their back is covered because they know the infrastructure exists. And this is the big challenge. And I think many of the people on your course will be in a position to kind of mind the gap in between that micro and that macro, and really begin to kind of say, we need to get that join up actually. And sometimes, just reference the work of New Local for a second. Sometimes that is about saying, let's be generous and modest about what we can do. So sometimes that might be about saying, well, actually the solution is to create a neighbourhood pool budget where different agencies pitch in. So it isn't just our friends who are listening in health, but you have incredible convening power. So you can reach out to your colleagues and say, it's happened in Milwaukee, for example, a beautiful example of this, where the level of knife crime and gun crime had gone through the roof in 15 neighborhoods. And our friends in police reached out to public health and said, how about we reimagine enforcement through the lens of public health? Stop thinking about trying to, end knife crime and deal with gun crime, and really start thinking about this as a public health issue. And they initiated what's known as a blueprint for peace. And one of the things that happened was, as they really listened to communities, what the community said is, help us organize. We're fragmented, we're disconnected. We can't actually even get a conversation going because there's so much crime. And so the police were prepared to take some of their resource, relocate it into public health, and then that money was able to go down into local neighbourhoods to employ community animators, to do what public health couldn't do and to do what police couldn't do. So there was a huge generosity of spirit there to say, let's relocate some authority and equity. And I think this is important. We often relocate responsibility, but we don't relocate power. We don't really, relocate equity and say, well, what if the community had the resource? What would they do? So, that to me, the Leeds people were trying and continue to try and do that. And that's been independently evaluated by Leeds Beckett. And it's impressive. The other micro example is from Hodge Hill in Birmingham. So this is where a local Church of England minister who lives in Hodge Hill in Birmingham, still to this day, Al Barrett, decided he didn't want to do the classic kind of let's set up a food bank or let's set up, something that we do to or for people, but he wanted to create the conditions where people could really begin to take on issues of food sovereignty or whatever they wanted to do. So he initiated a listening campaign where essentially himself and 12 people, most of whom were not of faith, so they were just people in the neighbourhood, went about, listening to what mattered to people. So they went into the bumping places and the gathering places. But one of the things that they did, which I thought was superb, was they listened for connectors in the neighbourhood as distinct from leaders. So these are people who naturally exist in the ecosystem of every community that are really good at building relationships. They nurture the social soil, and often they're quite modest. Often they will not come to a consultation or a meeting, but they have a natural disposition to connect people without the expectation that those people turn into their followers. So it's quite different from leadership, and actually quite distinct from networking as well, I would say. They found 93 of these connectors, and they went and had conversations with each of them and said, would you bring 4 people from your street or your block to a party? And so they were able to convene 500 people. Now that neighbourhood is a population of about 5,000, so that's 10% of the population. But what's significant, I think, is what they're engaged in is not addition, it's multiplication, because those connectors on average could know anywhere between 20 to 100 of their neighbours. So if you start thinking about that, you start to go, my goodness, these 500 people have actually an inroad to thousands of people in their neighbourhood. Now, the depth of possibility, if you're starting a process, a 10-year process with that level of responsibility at the neighbourhood level, I just think things are possible that are not possible by saying, let's do an obesity program or smoking cessation program, or indeed even let's just try and create a plan and you get a steering group together. Because now what you have is you literally have the nodes, the inroads into the ecosystem of community. So here's a micro example. Now, what they did over time was they benefited from some funding, which was fantastic, and the funding from Big Lottery and the funding from Big Local enabled them to become part of a Big Local initiative, one of the better known ones. So they were able to employ animators to keep that work going. And that was important because there's some really complex issues there around inclusion, racialized, issues and so forth. So they've continued over 10 years to do that. And I think that has, from the ground up, really radically changed their relationship with institutions.
I just want to quickly just ask about the community animator, because you've mentioned that a couple of times. Do you see that as being the key route into playing that sort of ABCD role for the public sector is through the community animator? Or is that just one tool and one technique? Is there a sort of variety of others?
That's a good question. I think it's an important one for sure. There are other ways. Yeah, you look at the likes of Seattle, for example, Seattle city government. What they've done quite significantly, just to give you a sense of the ecosystem and why this is only one, albeit one important one. Back in, I think, around 88, they were looking at financial bankruptcy, actually, as a city, close to. And so they negotiated a new social contract. And one of the things that they did, which I think was incredibly clever, was they set up a department of neighborhoods. So this structurally, they structured one department the way people structured their lives, as opposed to by issue or silo or function. So that was significant. And out of that, they then decentralized the staff in that department into neighborhoods. So they had kind of mini town halls in every neighborhood. Second, really clever thing. Because, you do all kinds of things by doing that, including just investing in the local economy. But it's the opposite of what a lot of institutions do when they're facing economic difficulty, where they centralize, they decentralize. Really important. The third thing that they did was they introduced neighbourhood matching funds. So the neighbourhood matching funds basically said, Adam, if you live in a neighbourhood and you can get three of your neighbours together and you're going to do something for the good of the neighbourhood, we'll recognise every hour that you spend as having a value of $15 an hour and we'll match it. And since 88, by doing that, they have essentially leveraged is probably not a great word, but they've invited thousands and thousands of people to be involved in community life who wouldn't have gotten involved in the old, let's get people to volunteer way. The other thing is it's an incredible measure because now I can say, well, I know exactly how many hours people have actually contributed and I know how much money we've invested. And so I can say for the 88 million, whatever, I don't know what it is, over the last probably a lot more, that the city has invested. Here's the return, and I guarantee you that the number of hours that they got back were way in excess of what they put in money. So it's really interesting. It has a case point, you probably know this, but I think you told me this actually, Adam, at one stage, that Seattle's the best place to have a heart attack because so many people know what to do. It's also a great place if you like parks and so on. So a lot of that is actually driven by neighborhood community, sweat equity, as they'd call it in America. The fourth thing they did was what I call neighborhood animators. They'd probably call them community organizers. And in the UK, often they're called community builders. So different strokes for different folks. I have a very specific reason for calling them community animators, which I suspect we don't have a huge amount of time to get into. But the shorthand is that I think an animator, as opposed to an activator, thinks about community like a gardener, not an engineer. So they're breathing life into a situation, but it's very light touch. So animator, it's I like the term. And I also like some of its heritage. So it comes from some of the work in France and Italy. So community animatore in Italy was very much kind of about you do what you need to do to enable the community to be in the driving seat, but you're not taking control. You're not speaking for the community. It's very much about precipitating rather than providing. And that I like that framing a lot.
Yeah. Okay, final question, because unfortunately running out of time. What are the implications of everything you've said for the way people approach leadership in the public sector? If you want to work in this much more asset-based, community-led way, what needs to shift in terms of mindset and practices as a leader? And it'd be really helpful if you could talk about that, both as a public sector leader who might be operating at a sort of more local, regional level, but also what that means for people operating at a sort of senior national strategic level as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, happy to do that. So, one of the things I'm just thinking about the net value of this, that in a democracy, as I understand it, policy level, a democracy is defined as, in a way, what happens after the important work of citizenship is done, right? So I know you can kind of think of like my role as a professional, as a practitioner, is kind of very much to take the lead from citizens and associations and kind of add value to that. Now, at every single level, you can think about that as that. What does that mean? Well, that means all of our institutions, all of our policies should be community first, not institution first. Mm-hmm. That we're really trying to think about community being the new front door. The challenge is that at the very moment I'm saying that, we're facing a higher level of expectation and demand than at any time in history on our institutions to be institution first, and ironically, the lowest level of trust. So this is absolutely, bamboozling for most policymakers and commentators. So I think one of the challenges that we have is we need to relocate authority. Too much authority has gone into the institutional space, and so we have a domineering and a dominant story, like I said at the beginning, that's very much saying our health, our safety, our education, and so forth is very institutionally centered. I would argue, and I think most people know that are, looking at the evidence, that that's just simply not the whole truth. That a very central part of the move in society, it's almost like we have two tools for change. One is institutions, very important. The other is community. So if I was in a leadership position, a policy position, a localized leadership position, wherever it might be in the system, I would really want to be relocating authority and equity into community alternatives. And I would really want to be asking very tough questions about things like, why have we so many kids coming into care? Why have we not thought more about family, kinship, community solutions? I would want to be really quite jaundicely looking at instrumentality. I'd be questioning things like food banks and saying, yeah, I understand that in an emergency we need them, but what are we moving towards to ensure we don't need them? How do we move from a charity model into a sovereignty model? To do that, unfortunately, we need to build an ecosystem that doesn't really exist at the moment. And I think this is where the practicalities come in, So it's one thing to think about it at a policy level and, think about things like neighbourhood matching schemes, the structural, reality of a neighbourhood, a department of neighbourhoods, which again you can kind of create a UK version of, because that's what Katie Kelly did when she in East Ayrshire, she encouraged the Vibrant Communities team. What she was doing was going under the radar and avoiding all the structural craziness in politics and just saying, hey, anybody who has a heart for community, let's buddy up and do some good work. So, I think from a policy perspective, Whitehall right through, there needs to be a negotiation of surrender here. You can see this in hospitals too, where the acute folks, like it's almost like the iron rule, that there will be two classes of people in society and in our institutions. One class of people are missional and are community first people, and the other are institutional and they're institution first. And the iron rule is the second will always govern over the first.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be broken. Now, it will either be broken bottom up because lots and lots of people will organize and they'll push against the system, or it will be broken at some level because the system actually starts realizing the platform is burning and it needs to move in a different direction. I can't prophesy, I don't have a crystal ball to know what way that goes, but I know what way I'd prefer it to go. And I think one of the ways of just releasing some of the pressure and the polarization and maybe some of the extremism that we see in society is to give people the power to plan and the power to connect at local level, to kind of think of the neighborhood as a primary unit of change, a primary unit of health, the primary unit of safety. So in a way, leaders at the national level would probably think a lot about the kind of the mile wide, inch deep frame of change. I guess what we're asking them to do is think about things from an inch wide, mile deep. Of course, not everybody's going to go into the neighborhood and be a community animator, but there's kind of cascading things that we can do which enable some of this stuff to happen. And also, there's lots and lots of things that we're currently doing which disables it and which blocks it. So there are lots of people, I would argue, that are naturally doing community animation right now. And at every hand's turn, because of the way commissioning works, because of the way procurement works, because of the way service transformation works, their autonomy and their sovereignty and their native nous is being damaged and they're being really, beaten down. In a lot of ways. So either they're having to find a way to be Trojan mice and kind of work to the cracks, or they're burning out.
Mm-hmm.
So, that principle of do no harm,
Yeah.
I think that's a key starting point. But, there's some very practical things that we could do and we know work. So there is something about that neighborhood as the primary unit of change. There's something about then the practicalities of what does that look like on Monday morning. And some of the ideas that I've shared may be useful. The other thing, and I'll just finish on this, what does success look like? My wife and I used Khalil Gibran's wonderful poem from the Prophet on marriage to remind each other that there should be great space in our togetherness. And I would say that it's really, really important that we understand that if we're doing this work, we should have an exit strategy. Now,
Mhm.
this is a little bit of a challenge because I would say in that instance, sometimes the being with people is about stepping back. And it may, in fact, be about just encouraging people to be self-determining and sovereign and by themselves. Again, invite us back in with at any time. And I think that's a really important, the hashtag with is a really important contribution to the conversation. And I think they complement each other. But it's very hard for me to know what I can do with you in order to enable your agency until I first take care to find out what you can do
Yeah,
by yourself or with your neighbours.
yeah. No, that's a very succinct description of the relationship between doing with and doing by, which unfortunately we haven't got time to look at in more detail. But no worries, because I think that was an incredibly rich and helpful conversation. Really, your insight of the last 30 years of working on ABCD is so powerful and useful. So thank you very, very much for your time, Cormac.
My
Really,
pleasure.
really
Happy to
appreciate it.
do it. Always happy.